Welcome to the Jenna Ellis Show, sponsored by Legacy Precious Metals. There has never been a better time to invest in precious metals. Visit legacypminvestments.com. That's legacypminvestments.com.
Welcome to this Friday, Memorial Day weekend Eve edition of Jenna Ellis Tonight. I'm obviously not Jenna. I'm John Cardillo, filling in for Jenna while she takes a much needed and well-deserved vacation. Lots been said about China. We hear about China trade. We hear about China flexing its muscle around the world. We hear about China allying with Russia, North Korea. A lot of bad actors. But recently there was a drill in the Straits of Taiwan where the Chinese Navy made some, well, let's just say aggressive moves, and some seem to think this is a precursor to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Let me introduce you to my next guest, an expert in the region. Scott Uehlinger was an officer in the United States Navy, as well as a station chief for the Central Intelligence Agency. Scott, great to see you, my friend. Been too long.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks a lot, John.
So, Scott, you've been my go-to guy for anything regarding the Straits of Taiwan for a very long time. We've spoken on air and off air countless times. You operated in that region. Right. You were a United States naval officer in that region. You're familiar with these exercises. So these new, let's call them speculations. I won't call them rumors, but speculations, because even some state media in the region is saying, hey, we're closer to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan than we've been in a very long time. But you were literally on the ground, on the sea there. What's your take on this?
Well, I do think that the chances of some kind of unfortunate incident happening are greater right now. But I do think, and I certainly hope, that we are a couple of years from an actual potential Taiwanese invasion by China. We have to understand that the distance in the Taiwan Straits is more than 90 miles, and there's actually a very short window in the year where it is free of storms and would be viable to do some sort of amphibious invasion.
Okay, so what you're saying is they've got a very narrow window of time, and because it's seasonal, it's also predictable. So it's a lot more difficult for China to engage in a sneak attack, so to speak.
That's right. It's funny, in the old days, let's say 15 years ago or more, there was a lot of speculation that China would use ballistic missiles to basically annihilate Taiwan. But we know now that that really isn't the case, and that's what American security officials are planning on, because Taiwan, with its cutting edge chip technology and such, is such a bounty for China that they would not risk destroying it. What they would want to do is capture the island intact. And so that is one reason why the Chinese Navy has expanded its capabilities very widely in the past 10 years, to the point that now the Chinese Navy has expanded enormously in the past 10 years or so, and Chinese maritime infrastructure is very great. Now, the problem is that since World War II, the United States has not faced any kind of a war at sea situation. So if there was a potential conflict between China and the United States, it would resemble the Pacific War against Japan, with U.S. Navy forces being the preeminent and most important player in those scenarios. But the problem is that our infrastructure is a fraction of what it used to be even 30 years ago. And so only now, very late in the game, is the United States looking closely at important things like shipyard capability, repair capability. Not only do you have to build the ships, you have to have the ability to repair them if there is some kind of battle. And so this is something that the United States is desperately trying to play catch up with as China continues to be aggressive in the area.
So, Scott, let me ask you, though, what was it about this drill? I mean, we've seen drills in the region. You and I spoke about them on air. I remember this maybe 5-6 years ago. But what was it about this particular drill that led to all this speculation, even from state media, that this could be a precursor to an invasion?
Right. This drill is very unusual because it features a very large number of live fire exercises. So these vessels have been operating around Taiwan for many years now. Sometimes they violate the seas of Taiwan, sometimes they don't. They violate the airspace of Taiwan with their air forces. However, this drill featured a lot of live fire exercises, meaning you're firing live missiles at targets to destroy them. You're launching anti-ship cruise missiles from aircraft. So lots of real ordnance is being dropped, bombs being dropped in safety zones, but these safety zones are around Taiwan. So this is perhaps the most intimidating that China has been with Taiwan.
Let me ask you this. Taiwan elected itself a new president. His name is Lai Ching-te in January, just a couple of months ago. And
That's right.
he believes in Taiwanese independence, but he's backed off his hard line. And he's essentially saying, well, we don't really need to push it anymore because we're independent. It's okay. We can be proud to be Taiwanese, but also proud of our Chinese roots. Diplomatically, put on your CIA hat as we get to the end of the segment. Diplomatically, is it a smart move, or is Xi Jinping seeing this as weakness and capitulation?
I think this is a pretty smart move by the president. Clearly, these exercises have taken place because this Taiwanese candidate won the election. If the other candidate had won, who was not as keen on independence, these drills, are very aggressive exercises, would not have happened. But at the same time, Taiwan is rapidly building up its defensive capability, which it has let slide for a number of years now. And so, in the meantime, certainly, I think it's prudent for the president to diplomatically say that, okay, we're okay with the status quo right now. We're not going to make some kind of a sudden move like declare independence, because let's face it, Taiwan enjoys de facto independence. The status quo is fine for Taiwan. But if Taiwan decides to make some kind of formal declaration of, renouncing, it is no longer part of the PRC, then there could be a problem. So I think the president is being pretty smart here.
Scott, last 15 seconds. What should the U.S. Navy be doing right now in the region? 15 seconds.
Well, the Navy should continue its patrols in the Straits of Taiwan, and also, more importantly, around a lot of the reefs in the entire South China Sea and East China Sea that China is stating is their own sovereign territory. This is not recognized by international law, and so the United States should continue, along with its allies, to keep the seaways open.
All right. Thanks, Scott. Much more with Scott Uehlinger. We're going to be talking about Israel and Hamas when we come back. You're with John Cardillo, sitting in for Jenna Ellis on Jenna Ellis Tonight. Welcome back to Jenna Ellis Tonight. I'm John Cardillo, in for Jenna. We've been speaking with my good friend Scott Uehlinger, retired U.S. naval officer and CIA chief of station. Scott, let's switch gears from China now. Let's talk a little bit about the situation in Israel, what Netanyahu's facing, and with the death of Iranian President Raisi, how much more aggressive, how much more proactive do you feel the IRGC is going to be? Because they've always reported to the Supreme Leader Khamenei anyway. Right? They don't report to the president of Iran. But are they seeing Raisi's death as an opportunity to ramp up their surrogate attacks on Israel and other Western allies in the region?
I don't think, John, that with the sudden death of Raisi, I don't think that the IRGC is going to be in the near term ramping up attacks against Israel. That event alone, I don't think, is sufficient to do that. However, we do have the International Court at The Hague condemning not only Hamas, but also Netanyahu. And that's certainly something the Iranians plan to exploit, I'm sure. And I think more important than the death of Raisi was the recent Iranian relatively failed attack of ballistic missiles, et cetera, against Israel. Most of the weapons failed. And I think that overall, the big picture is that the IRGC believes that it is more effective. They get more bang for the buck by going through cutouts such as Hezbollah and Hamas rather than a direct attack, which basically is much more of a threat to the regime in Iran, which now, perhaps more than in the last several years, is increasingly shaky.
You know, Scott, I'm glad you brought up the ICC, the International Criminal Court in The Hague, because what they did is just mind-boggling to me. But I want you to tap your CIA experience and let's talk about back channels and things that happen behind the scenes that most people either don't understand or will never understand because they make no sense. What is the calculus? What is the logic of the ICC calling Israeli leaders criminals when the world, and I mean the world, watched Hamas storm into homes and murder families, murder sleeping babies in their cribs? What is the end game here for The Hague?
Question, John, and it's a mystery. It's the same sort of destructive communist thinking that basically has undermined Columbia University and other universities that are boldly demonstrating their anti-Semitism. So why the ICC would compromise its reputation by going after Israel at the same time, by the way, as they're sanctioning Hamas. They never mentioned Hamas on October 7th or shortly thereafter, but now they lump Netanyahu in with Hamas as if they're both equally guilty. So it's really unknown what their end game is, except to undermine any kind of respect that this institution once had in Western eyes.
Yeah, I mean, are they hoping to be killed last by the terrorists? Are they adhering to some type of globalist left-wing worldview where hating Israel is just fashionable, right? If you were a Democrat from 2015 to today, hating Donald Trump is fashionable. Hating Ron DeSantis is fashionable. Hating any conservative, there's really no logic behind it. And you brought up Columbia University. We saw those protests at Columbia University. I like to call them pro-Hamas rallies, where you've got these students and they're asked, what are you protesting? Do you even know what Hamas is? Do you know what happened on October 7th? They have no idea. Could it be that simple? Could the ICC just be suffering from that type of leftist cognitive dissonance?
I really do think that that's true, John. I think that is what is happening right now. It's utterly ridiculous. Somehow, the ICC, which of course is dominated by, relatively speaking, rich white people, they somehow feel that because, let's say, Israel has a technological military edge over Hamas, that automatically Hamas is the underdog, the poor underdog that has to be pitied. There is no real logic to it, but unfortunately, it's the world we live in right now.
Who would you say the outside of Hamas and Hezbollah, who are the ones to watch right now, whether funded by Iran or not? Which emerging terror groups should Americans be keeping their eye on?
Well, John, I think that one of the main threats is the Houthi rebels, which have effectively shut down the Gulf of Aden to world shipping. Now, they've generated some headlines, but not nearly the headlines that they should be generating. The resulting supply chain disruptions are going to be reflected in prices in the near future. We're looking at about 50% of trade that usually passed through the Suez Canal is being blocked now. Those shipments are arriving very late. This type of thing would have commanded daily headlines for a month 30 years ago or 20 years ago. Now it's just maybe you might want to know this type of thing. It's a disaster. It's a disaster for world trade.
This is going to affect Americans in their wallet eventually, isn't it?
That's right. It absolutely is. And
I remember, to your point about the Biden administration's response being abysmal, I agree. I remember under the Trump administration, the United States and their allies had some pretty robust anti-piracy efforts. I'm not seeing that under the Biden administration. What are your former U.S. Navy colleagues telling you?
That's very true. The problem is that the United States is totally playing defensive ball right now. All we're doing is the enemy is throwing missiles at us, and we're using our shield, but we're not using our sword at all. So basically, they're continuing to take pot shots at the United States Navy, and eventually they're going to hit something. But unfortunately, the Biden administration does not have the will to allow the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Air Force to take the fight directly to the Iranian arms suppliers, to destroy the weapons marshaling points, et cetera, in Yemen, not in any effective manner. That is the only way you're going to stop this. But playing defensive ball is an absolutely losing proposition.
Scott, always an absolute pleasure. I become much smarter on these issues every time I speak to you. Scott Uehlinger, everybody. Thanks very much, Scott. We'll be right back with more Jenna Ellis Tonight.
Stacey Washington Now, your go-to for a fresh, informed take on the political world. Stacey tackles today's crucial issues with a dynamic blend of news, opinion, and analysis. Don't miss Stacey Washington Now, weekdays at 5 p.m. Eastern on SNC.
Have you heard? Jenna Ellis Tonight is on 5 nights a week. Count on Jenna Ellis for insightful commentary on the day's biggest stories.
We can still consistently be conservatives.
Jenna Ellis Tonight, weeknights at 9 p.m. Eastern on Salem News Channel. Start your Sunday morning early with Stacey Washington at 6, Jenna Ellis at 7, and Andrew Wilkow at 8. All part of SNC Weekend and only on Salem News Channel. It's another Sunday to remember this Sunday with Charlie Kirk at 9 a.m., the Speaker of the House, and a brand new episode of Laura Trump at 11 Eastern on Salem News Channel.
Welcome back to Jenna Ellis Tonight. I'm John Cardillo in for Jenna. Well, Donald Trump had a rally, and of all places, the Bronx, New York City, the boogie down Bronx. I know it well. I was actually a cop in the Bronx, started there as a rookie. Here, for more on that, is my good friend, head of investigations at V24 Investigations, Matthew Tyrmand. Matt, good to see you.
Always a pleasure, JC.
So let me ask you, what do you think the logic of Team Trump was in having a rally in the Bronx? I mean, this is AOC country. This is deep blue. The Bronx does not go Republican, never has. I know this area very, very well. Patrolled it as a rookie. It worked there, did investigations there. I know Crotona Park, where the rally was held. Was it worth the spend for the Trump campaign? Because I don't see, I hear these people saying New York is in play for Donald Trump, but I just don't see it, especially the Bronx. So what do you think? What was the calculus here? What was the logic behind holding that rally?
Well, there's a few things. One, Trump has been in trial in New York, so keeping things closer afield to get optics for national press, media. Here we are talking about it on a national press show. That makes sense. He doesn't have to go too far. Obviously, he's got a coalition with the New York Young Republicans Club. He spoke at their gala last December, and that's where supposedly they hatched this idea. You know, they did the one in Inwood a few weeks ago in sort of a heavily Dominican community. They call it, I think, like the Bodega Rally, because that's a neighborhood filled with bodegas. Look, I agree with you. The Bronx is not flipping. In fact, the Bronx went further to the left the last few years when they ejected Joe Crowley, who was South Bronx, North Queens, and replaced him with AOC, as far left as it gets. The Bronx County is a machine, much like many other urban centers around the country, and including in New York, but more so than even Queens and Brooklyn. The Bronx Democratic machine does control it. Look, now we're seeing all the righty talking heads saying New York is in play. That is absolute nonsense. New York is no more in play than Massachusetts, California, Illinois. There are swing states in play because now this election is more a referendum on Joe Biden's failure as a president than even a referendum on Trump and how much the center moderates, independents like or dislike Trump. But certainly this is a lot of bluster that the Bronx is going to help drive the New York State Electoral College vote count to the right. That's just not happening. But easy to do. Good optic. They're saying 25,000. I don't think it was 25,000. I don't think it was 100,000 in Wildwood either. But this has always been a function of the Trump talking head machine is inflation of the numbers. And then we see the real results when people vote, and turnout will be probably not as high as they're projecting.
Yeah, Matt, but talk about turnout for a moment, because every time there's a rally, every time there's a Trump rally, going back to 2016, the Trump campaign puts out one number, the critics put out a different number, and then a video surfaces or a photo surface. And the truth is somewhere in the middle. ABC, local ABC 7 in New York, though, had an aerial shot, and I believe it's while Trump was on stage, and the crowd looked to be only, I would say, the mid to high single-digit thousands at best. Now, people might say, well, he just started speaking, or he was finishing and people, I don't know. But I didn't see a crowd of 30,000. But that said, does it even matter? I don't believe rally size translates to electoral votes, electoral wins. But that all said, how much of that crowd do you think were from the Bronx and they're organically, or were supporters invited off of mailing lists controlled by the campaign and its surrogate?
I do think that that aerial shot takes a very full picture. You look at Trump rallies, the practices, people get there early. It's like tailgating. Nobody's coming in and out in the middle of Trump speaking. He's the main attraction. It's a spectacle. It's a circus. They're there under the proverbial big top. Look, Crotona Park and that open area is not massive. This is not the sheep meadow in Central Park. So, to fill it up, they probably chose it as a result of you can pack in, several thousand people and make it look larger than it appears with a drone shot, with an aerial. There were thousands of people there. Was it 25,000? No way. Was it, plus minus 10,000, give or take? Perhaps, but that does not create a proxy of, the Bronx County, which is what, 1 million people. New York City, which is 8 million people. New York State is what, 15 to 20 million people. Right. How many people were there from the Bronx? Well, the New York Young Republicans Club, they're all a bunch of Manhattanites at this point. Some maybe from Brooklyn and Queens originally, but it's not a overwhelming local representation. I think probably you had a lot of people from the Staten Island Republicans, et cetera. It's easy to hop on the 456 and, go on up to the Bronx. We do it for Yankee games all the time. So I think that probably you're correct in assessing that this is not an overwhelming percentage of people who are Bronx locals voting in Bronx politics.
You know what concerns me? What concerns me is too many on the right are getting complacent. They're looking at these anecdotal incidents. A couple of rappers get on stage with Trump. He jokes around about wanting to have gold teeth like them. And they take that to mean that statistically Trump has won the black vote, the Hispanic vote. They're getting very complacent, which I think is an incredibly dangerous thing for Republican voters and what's going to be a razor-thin election, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, even if there is a giant uptick in black and Hispanic voting for Republicans, as we've seen over the last few cycles, it has upticked. It still does not overwhelmingly move the needle because look, there's some swing states where it helps, but there's a lot where it won't have much impact. It's not going to have an overwhelming impact in places like Arizona, Nevada, and Wisconsin. Maybe it does in Michigan and Georgia, but it's not a fait accompli that, okay, you go from, 12 or 15% to 23 or 24%, and boom, the election's over. The deepest founts of black votership are in already Dem stronghold states like New York, like Illinois, like California. So even if there is some change on the margin, does that change the entire distributive model of votes? I don't think it does. I certainly see complacency, but the confidence they're trying to push forward, it's good for fundraising. And he is fundraising. He's fundraising from the high dollar guys, and he's closing the gap with some of Biden's fundraising. You're seeing now some tech guys in California like David Sachs and Chamath Palihapitiya are hosting him in California. So he's going to raise some money, and he needs to sell these optics that, it's very competitive or that he's winning. And that's how you bring the money in. So I think that's part of the strategy for him.
Hey, Matt, in the last 30 seconds we have here, real quick, V24 has been doing some great exposés on campus. 30 seconds, what can we expect to see from V24 investigations in the next couple of months?
Sure, awesome. Yeah, V24 investigations, investigative journalism unit under Visegrad 24, which is obviously a big social media account that most on the right do follow internationally, based out of Poland, worked with the guys for years. Started the investigative unit. We've done Columbia, UCLA, Berkeley, Rutgers. We've got a school that you and I know well from our local areas, haunts in New York, coming soon next week. After that, we have another school. And then school year's over, we'll be pivoting to investigate what I expect to happen, which will be another summer of love, 2020 BLM style, but this time around Israel-Palestine. The left will try and rip apart the fabric of society, starting in the central business districts of the biggest cities and swing states. Expect to see it happen.
Gotta let you go, Matt. Sounds great to me. Matt Tyrmand, looking forward to those exposés. We'll be back with more Jenna Ellis tonight. I'm John Cardillo. Welcome back to Jenna Ellis Tonight. I'm John Cardillo in for Jenna. I mean, doesn't it feel like we hear the words election and border over and over again? And we should. It's an incredibly important election year. And what's happening at our southern border, especially in the state of Texas, is just egregious. I believe people in the Biden administration should be criminally prosecuted. Let me bring in my next guest, who I think might agree with me on that second point, Brandon Gill. He's a congressional candidate, a Republican congressional candidate for Texas's 26th congressional district, and himself a Texan. Brandon, welcome.
John, thanks for having me.
You know, I always ask, whenever I see somebody young, somebody successful, somebody who could pretty much succeed in whatever they want to do, I ask them the same question when I interview them. Why in the world get into the dirty game of American politics? I love it. So many of us who study it love it. But then we look at ourselves and say, we're not normal people. But then I look at a guy like you, clearly can succeed wherever you want to go. You're young, world ahead of you. Why jump in and run for Congress?
Well, that's exactly right. And first of all, thanks for having me on. And I appreciate that. You know, there's a lot of things that I could be doing with my life. I had a great career in finance prior to starting a conservative media business that was going very well before I jumped into this. One of the things that I've noticed across the country that I think we need to work on a lot is that we have a lot of very conservative districts across the country that are represented by more moderate and more establishment, oftentimes Republicans. And that's got to change. We can't allow half the country, the Republican base, to have no real representation in Washington. And that's why I jumped into this race most fundamentally, to make sure that the conservative district, Texas 26, which is a R+13 district, is represented by somebody whose values align with the values of the voters. And that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah, I can't tell you how frustrating it is. We had a situation down here in South Florida several years back when Carlos Jimenez was elected to Congress. And I remembered him as a fixture in Miami-Dade politics, and I knew he was incredibly moderate. And when he won that primary, I knew we'd be disappointed. And one of his first votes was against gun rights with Democrats. Now, he's made some good ones, but things like that are so disheartening to voters, especially conservative voters, because they vote for you because you tell them you're going to stand up for them, for the Constitution, and then you get to Congress, and so many of these people go along to get along. Was that part of the catalyst that had you jump in? Were you frustrated by constantly seeing that happen over and over?
I was, and I have been. It feels like we've been dealing with the same thing for 2 decades now, is that you have a Republican base, a Republican Party. The people, the voters, are actually very conservative. They're socially conservative. They're fiscally conservative. They want smaller government. They don't want government getting their tentacles in every aspect of American life. But in order to stop that, we need Republicans in Washington and in Austin. I'm from Texas, of course, but we need Republicans who are willing to fight for what we believe in. And too often we get representatives from, again, conservative districts like mine who get into D.C. and they're just inundated by the swamp. They realize that there are lobbyists who will take them out to really fancy dinners, give them great wine, the best wine they've ever had in their lives. They'll tell them, here's how Washington works. And if you want to have a career here, if you want to be liked here, if you want to walk into the Republican clubs that we hang out in, here's how you need to vote. And here are the things that we need you to do. Here are the things the bills we need you to push. Now, that's very different from what the voters of these Republicans want oftentimes. And too often we get Republicans who will get there and will choose D.C. over their voters. And that's a huge problem. And to your point earlier, that's a big reason why I jumped into this race. But you're exactly right. We have too many Republicans who sell out as soon as they get to D.C. because they want the next shiny thing, and they screw over the rest of the country.
Well, they also need the money those lobbyists are going to funnel to them to get reelected. I mean, ultimately, that's the draw. Yeah, they get drunk on power and they get drunk on the fame and the media hits, but money fuels politics, right? It's a vote is currency, and actual money is currency in politics, and those are about the only two. Let's switch gears for a moment. As a Texan going to Congress, and by all accounts, +13, our district, you're probably going to win this race. You're going to get there, and the number one problem, a problem that's causing all the others, in my opinion, is the border. Well, the Biden administration, but if we look at a specific issue, it's the border. People flooding into our country. Senator Marco Rubio, I watched him on one of the Sunday shows when he corrected the host. They said 11 million illegals. He was right. He said they're using an outdated number. It's closer to 25, 30 million. Now, real quick, and then I'll turn over to you. I was law enforcement. There are about 700 or so thousand law enforcement officers in the U.S., state, local, federal. If they did nothing ever again in their careers except 24/7, 365, try to deport illegals, they might get 5% of them. So knowing that we simply don't have the resources to round up and deport, what do we do?
Well, first of all, I would say that if we want to understand how we should approach the border crisis, we've got to understand why we're in this crisis to begin with, right? We know that what Joe Biden is doing on the border is all entirely intentional. Everybody knows that. They're doing it to flood this country with people that they believe, the Democrats believe, will be perpetual, reliable Democrat voters. And they're also doing it to sow the seeds of chaos and destruction in our own communities here in America, to create an environment, a crisis for big government to step in and solve. And so, to your point, we do have to have deportations, and we got to do them on a very, very large scale. And President Trump knows that. He's talked about it. He's described it. His administration has described it as being the largest mass deportation operation in American history, and we've got to do it.
Yeah, but how do we do it? Where do we find the bodies? Do we use the National Guard? Do we bring in the military? Law enforcement just does not. I agree with you 100%. Every word you say, including mass deportations. My question is how? Last 45 seconds to you.
Yep. This is a matter of political will more than anything else. You know, we can round up every grandma who is in D.C. for January 6th. If we can do that, we can solve this border crisis. We can find these people. Now, if we don't have the resources for law enforcement, we've got a National Guard who can do it. We've got a military who can do it. But the number one job of our government in Washington is to defend this country from an invasion on our southern border, from an invasion anywhere. So if they're not going to do that, what else is the purpose of our government in D.C.? So my view is that we've got to figure out a way to deport these people. And if law enforcement can't do it, if they don't have the resources, then Washington needs to step in and either get it to them or get the military or the National Guard involved.
I agree with every word you're saying, Brandon. Brandon Gill, thank you very much. Best of luck in your race, Brandon. We'll be right back with more Jenna Ellis tonight. Welcome back to Jenna Ellis Tonight. I'm John Cardillo, in for Jenna. You know, I want to talk to you a little bit about red states and blue states. And I can speak to this one with some authority. I mean, people are pontificating about it night and day. But I grew up in New York City, in the city, grew up in Queens, was a cop in the Bronx, lived in Manhattan, was born in Brooklyn. I think the only borough I never touched was Staten Island. And then I moved down to Florida 20 years ago. My Florida-versary was February 23rd, 2024. I moved here in 2004. 20 years. And about 15 or so years ago, 12 to 15 years ago, I had written a piece for NRA magazine on my evolution from a New York City police officer who grew up in a very anti-gun, anti-Second Amendment climate to becoming a staunch, a vehement Second Amendment advocate. And it took place, maybe in about a year of being on the job in New York City. Now, I was never anti-gun. My dad took me shooting when I was 7 years old. We always had 22 rifles around, and handguns weren't as prevalent in New York. So I was pro-gun to the point I liked to shoot. I was a guy, I liked to shoot. But I never looked at gun policy. I never looked at liberty like I did when I moved down to South Florida. So in that NRA piece, I talked about my evolution. I was taught, in the police academy, you're taught you're trained and civilians aren't, and you are qualified to have a firearm, but the average person is not. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. You quickly learn that the cops I worked with shot far less recreationally than the private citizens I knew who owned firearms. They were training and firing more rounds downrange, far more than most of the police officers I worked with who went and qualified a couple of times a year. And no put down on them. These are great men and women who put their lives on the line every day. I'm talking about mentality, culture, and policy. And then I left law enforcement for the private sector and I began traveling. And I fortunately was able to travel to the southern United States, the Gulf Coast. And it was a more relaxed quality of life. Growing up in a blue state, growing up in a very blue city like New York, is the same as growing up in a very blue city like Chicago or Los Angeles. When I talk to friends of mine who have left those cities for the red states, the freer states, the states that value liberty, we all have similar cultural stories about the oppressive nature of government in those places. For example, right now you're seeing New York City wanting to impose draconian fees on people for the egregious crime of taking their car into the borough of Manhattan. It's just mind-blowing. Whereas in Florida, when the state has a couple of extra bucks in the coffers, and it's a fiscally conservative state, last I checked, our budget surplus down here in Florida was 25 or so billion with a B dollars. What does Florida do? Florida gives you toll relief on holiday weekends. There are no tolls. When you drive through those automated toll scanners, it's free. The blue states don't do things like that. It seems like every day they want to become more oppressive to the citizens of those states. You know, one of the most troubling conversations I've ever had, I was doing government affairs work back in my private life before I was in media, and I asked a legislator in a blue state, man, you guys have so many laws on the books. Everything one can possibly think about doing in their life is either criminalized or regulated. If they want to open a small business, you're telling them how many letters can be on the awning. In New York City, if a small business has too many letters on the awning of their little storefront, the fines can be up to $25,000. Isn't that insane? $25,000. So I asked this blue state legislator, a state senator, why? And his answer was one of the most frustrating things I'd ever heard. Well, he said, we're legislators. We legislate. What's the point of being here if our name isn't on a bill? If we don't leave a legacy? A legacy of what? Of oppression? Of blue state oppression? Meanwhile, you come down to states like Florida, you go to states like Texas. I love the Texas legislative model. Their state legislature only meets every 2 years on odd number years. So for 2 years, they leave, or a full year, they leave the citizens of their state alone. The Florida state legislature meets for a very short time. And oftentimes, the only bills that come out of that legislature are very conservative. For example, this time around, we got constitutional carry. There are draconian sentences and fines levied on people like child molesters and attempted murderers. And we tend to repeal things that make life more oppressive for the good people. So it's no wonder you take a state like Florida. Florida now has a nearly 900 or possibly even over 900,000 Republican voter advantage. 900,000 more Republican voters in Florida than Democrats. And I believe you're going to see that trend in more red states as these blue states become more oppressive to their citizens. But it's also baffling to me why people in the blue states continue to vote blue. Gretchen Whitmer was arguably, the governor of Michigan, one of the most oppressive, tyrannical human beings the United States has ever seen during COVID. All the while, her husband was launching his boat when other people were essentially being locked in their homes. Yet Michiganders reelected this woman by 10 points. I'll never understand these electorates. But what I do see from those states are people migrating south. They're rarely migrating west, but they're migrating south. They're coming to Florida. They're coming to the Carolinas. They're coming to Texas. These states are getting stronger. Take Florida, for example. We're a state, like I said earlier, with a $25 billion budget surplus and a nearly $1.3 trillion GDP, larger than European nations. And it's very simple as to why. Americans culturally want to be free. Americans don't need a nanny state. They don't need mayors and governors and far-left city councils telling them how to live their life, raise their children, go about their day, what color to paint their home, if they can protect themselves and their families. It is a terrible, terrible way to govern. But the only way it's going to change is if people wake up, do more research into what these politicians are really about, because it's power. and it's not public service. And it really is unique to blue state legislators. Thank you so much for being here with me tonight. This is John Cardillo filling in for Jenna Ellis. I hope you have an absolutely awesome Memorial Day weekend. Best to you and your families. Have a great night.